there, we got a snowstorm blowing in. I'm here in Utah, and I got to carry the mic up real close to my mouth because it doesn't look like it's doing too well out here in the storm. Anyhow, I want to thank you for stopping by my channel. Today we're going to cover how to utilize design principles in photography. So coming right up. I'm Thayne. I'm a filmmaker, photographer, artist, and educator. We got a snowstorm going on. It's just starting. It's got about 3 inches or 4 inches of snow. Anyhow, so today we're going to talk about photography and how we could utilize design principles in it. Okay, so before I get started, I just want to say I want to give you a little bit of information on each of the pieces as we go along, and at the end we'll talk more about design, what I'm thinking about when I'm photographing or either when I'm editing. So anyhow, hopefully you enjoy this little trip. All right, let's start with these couple of images here. This is in the very beginning. I was working for a commercial photographer / director in Los Angeles, and he would give me some suggestions, and then I'd watch him do those things. So, and I think I was using a Nikon Coolpix camera back then, and the model, very attractive. And you can see there's no real depth of field happening there. There is very little consideration of lighting other than the area was fairly well lit. And again, this is, right in the very beginning. All right, so let's jump ahead a few years. And I have left California and have moved to a small town in Idaho. And I have bought into a business partnership in a photo studio. And so now I'm learning also from a portrait photographer who was my business partner at the time. And I'm also looking to magazines. And in this case, you can see it's W Magazine. And I've taken out a couple of pages and I put it into my sketchbook, and I started to map out the different aspects that this photographer was using. So looking at lighting, looking at composition, looking at color, looking at all these different aspects from an artist's point of view, defining it, and then I can try to apply it as a photographer. Take a moment, look at this and how they have constructed each of these images, because it's very intentional, from the pose to bouncing light to how strong the light is on the light side versus the shadow side, versus like even with the shadow side where they've added a little bit of light to pull the ear out on both of these images. Very interesting. Here are some examples of high school senior portraits that I took over a decade ago. And you can see that I have definitely improved from the very first photos that I've been taking. I have been learning from my business partner, and of course, I have learned from the photographer I was working for before that, and of course, applying a few things that I've learned through magazines. Portrait photography is different from commercial photography. They both have different types of outcomes. You're going to see that these definitely look a lot different than what you'd say be in your magazine. Now, I still need some improvements, but at least I have made progress. So jumping years ahead, I have now left Idaho, closed down my portrait studio, moved to Utah. Very different from the portrait work I was doing before, and clearly progression from the very first time that I started shooting. This, of course, is studio lighting, where the other ones were all pretty much natural light. You can see that we have more of almost of a flat lighting that's happening. Very little shadow occurring. Focus, of course, is on the model themselves or on the makeup. Here are a couple of other examples. These are both taken now outdoors. This is an editorial, a commercial type of shoot for a company that makes or sells sunglasses. Fairly simple, Shallow depth of field, nothing too fancy happening here. I think we have a strobe, but other than that, straightforward. I was kind of going for more of a real just kind of feel to it. Nothing too fancy, too lit. Here is a commercial style shoot. There's not a whole lot happening in terms of additional lighting other than the ambient light that we're having. I believe there's also a strobe just to fill in a little bit, but for the most part, what we get to see here is the environment that this model is in. And pretty straightforward. Here are two other examples of very shallow depth of field. Again, using mostly natural light, a little flash to fill in some of the shadow areas, give an overall kind of a soft feel to it. Here are two other examples. The black and white one is actually indoors, but using window lighting. The one on the right, a little bit of a strobe happening. Here are a couple of examples, what people would probably call photo manipulation or photo illustration. The one on the right, if you look very closely, that's a woman there that's also a bonsai tree. And here on the left, there's not as much digital work done. This is actually in studio. You can see that there is two different light sources that are kind of coming in. Definitely have more blue versus the other one, a little bit more of the yellow happening in. And if we jump over here to the right, the main subject, the model, were photographed in studio, and then the rest of it added later. There's actually a ton of work in that particular image. Even that shadow is not even real, or that leaf that's laying down in that shadow is part of the tree and just made to look dead and everything. So anyhow, a lot of digital work happening in these two images. This too is highly manipulated. We have our main subject, the model there, that was photographed outside using a Canon. And the background, I believe it was photographed with my iPhone a year or so before. And then after that, there's just a lot of painting and color adjustments. And all the jewelry that she's wearing was put in there digitally. So if you were to actually zoom in there, you would see all this turquoise that she has on there is all digital. So all the lighting, everything in there is just highly enhanced. In these two examples, one was taken indoor, the one on the left, but using natural light through a window. And of course, the one on the right is definitely outdoors. Both have been manipulated digitally. The one on the left, digitally manipulated, all of that makeup was done via Photoshop, including her eye color, everything. On the right, there is very little Photoshop going on. There's some enhancing of colors and things like that. Some small things that were changed. Here is an example that we can break down. Two versions of the same image. Clearly one's black and white, one's with color, because it's real important to be able to see value. Value being the lightness and darkness. All right, let's break this down though. Let's start off with the rule of thirds. If you look at that grid on the left-hand side, you can see that the eyes are lining up on that third. So that's very intentional. The rest of it, I've kind of centered it. Let's look at lighting a little bit. Again, this is an outdoor lighting. I believe I might have a strobe just to soften up the shadows a little bit because it's very harsh lighting. The sun is setting. But what I was kind of going for a little bit is trying to get what's called Rembrandt lighting. And that is where you get that one side of the face is in light and the other side's in shadow. And you get this little triangle on the cheek. That little triangle on her cheek is a little on the high end. It should come down a little bit lower. But more or less, you're getting that kind of Rembrandt lighting. Also, what we could look at is I've got the depth of field, so we have that separation. Also in the background, on either side of her, we have these posts that are there. And that's very intentional. I was using those posts as what's called bookends, putting her in between those two. Looking at that negative space, the negative space is the opposite of the positive space. She, the model, is the positive space, and then all around her is the negative space. And you can see that that negative space varies in width and in size. So on the right hand side, you can look at that space between her and the post, all the way up, and there's that little space between her, top of her head pretty much, and the top of the composition. And then on the left-hand side, we got that much larger space from the post, or even from the edge if you want to the subject. And each of those are different. So that helps create the interest in this image. Also, let's take a look at the diagonals that are happening. Diagonals create an energy in the piece. It also can lead your eye. And so we have these creases in her shirt, the angles of her shoulders, and such, and even background that will lead your eye towards her face, because that is the main focus, is her face. And then very distinctly her eyes, because I said before, it's landing on the rule of thirds right there. And then I have all these other elements that lead your eye to her face. But here I want to talk more about color. Even though value is very, very critical, I want to talk about color. And what we have going on color-wise, we have a complementary color scheme going on, meaning that the colors are on the opposite side of the color wheel. So we've got her hair, her face, her skin tone lean towards orange. And you can see, looking at the example here, I've got some color swatches for you, in where I have taken the actual colors from the background and then also saturated them so that you can see that a lot more. And you can see that her skin tones are orangish, and the background is, of course, the sky. We got a little bit of mountains back in there too, and it is very blue. So those are on the opposite side of the color wheel, and it helps create that punch. You can also look at different diagonals I have going on, like with her arm, her head slightly tilted. There are a bunch of other things that are happening, even with the negative space. Primarily what I want you to look at, and just to consider, is color. In this final piece, this is very much, for me, illustrative. It's photograph based. We have the model there that I photographed, but she didn't have any of those feathers. Those were all added digitally, as well as the background. And just like the example before, I'm thinking of, again, a complementary color scheme. So here are the different colors that I am working with intentionally. I want it to really feel like it pops. I want it to feel look interesting. I really wanted that division happening. It's almost like a flip. If you look at the positive space, or look at the side on the left versus the side on the right, and you can see that there's this diagonal happening from the face down to the arm. And so I have these different things that are intentionally done. I wanted it to have this particular feel happening, and I wanted to have it feel very flat in the background, yet more dimensional. But as we move away from the face, again, it starts to flatten out, it starts to darken, it starts to disappear. And so it definitely has this very illustrative quality that's happening to it. But take a moment to review what's actually happening in the piece. I hope that you found this to be very useful, entertaining, to see where I started and pretty much where I am currently with photography. And you can see that Photoshop definitely has come in some aspects of where I wanted something to be more fantasy-like or illustrative or whatever you might want to call it, pointing out some of the things that I'm thinking of when I'm actually taking the photos. As well as I think of the same things when I'm in post, working in Photoshop, how I'm going to crop it and what I'm looking for and what I feel makes a good image. So I look at all these principles of design and apply it to the image that I'm working on. If you find this to be very helpful, please give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell, and also, if you wouldn't mind, please share. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.